One of the things that we learn from the Bible is that those events that seem to rattle us and they seem to be unwelcome events, God can use to bring great good out of. And that's exactly what the exile teaches us. When Judah was sent into Babylon, exiled into Babylon, a lot of people, a lot of the Jews, thought all hope was lost, when in fact, God used that season in the history of Israel to bring about great good. We're going to have a look at one of the leading characters, one of the leaders in this exile now, as we consider the life and the contribution of Daniel. We've seen that the Jews who were listening to Jeremiah were being told that they needed to repent. They needed to return to the covenant and be faithful once again to God. And to Jeremiah's disappointment, and no doubt God's disappointment as well, they didn't. And so we see that under King Jehoiakim, the Babylonians came in and made him a vassal in around about 601 BC. And with that, the king of Babylon took several of the officials, the palace officials, the elites, the nobles, away to Babylon. Among those was Daniel. And so we have the account now of Daniel where it tells us that that's when he was taken away, around in the first batch of the people who were exiled to Babylon. Daniel would have been possibly around about 15 years of age. He's gone to a culture that was radically different to the one that he was raised in. And it becomes very apparent as we read through Daniel that he was a very godly young man. He was a young man who knew God, and that becomes extremely obvious as we dive into, as we'll take a little bit of a journey through looking at how we can substantiate that in his book. What we have here is a young man who decided to make good friendships with the other young men that were taken with him. They were put under the charge of the chief of the eunuchs. Now that tells us that they were probably, the word is castrated and made eunuchs as well. So this young man, Daniel, becomes an exemplar, that is a high example of what it's like to serve God when circumstances are extremely adverse. So, in this section, I want to just draw out some quick application from what we see from the life of Daniel. So we're reading from Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of the Lord. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So that this is now referring to Babylon, Shinar, Babylon. And the name of the god was Bel. And we'll see this forms a part of some of the names that are mentioned in the book of Daniel. And Daniel's own name will be changed to Belteshazzar, which is a name that assigns to him under the god of Babylon. But we'll see that Daniel didn't identify with that name. Instead, he was Daniel, which has a much more Jewish flavour to it. In fact, I'm using the word Jewish, and that word Jewish originates in the exile. When these captives from Judah are taken into Babylon, they are nicknamed Jews because they were from Judah. Prior to that, they were known as Hebrews or Israelites. So we see that Daniel is going to have to stand up for what he believes in. As we read this passage, we see he's introduced into a completely foreign culture. We continue on. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Now, this is a tremendously important point for young people, particularly young men. And if you're a young man in your late teens or early 20s, I'm talking to you. I want you to notice here that Daniel had the potential in these areas. And I'm going to note 6 areas that Daniel had potential in. And I'm going to suggest to you that in these days that we are in, and the days that are to shortly follow, you young men need to consider deeply, if you love Christ, developing these 6 areas. These 6 areas, as we've just seen, they were young men who were well groomed. They had a good appearance, it says in the text. They were also young men who had developed a skill. They weren't lazy. They had developed a skill. Thirdly, they had learned how to be wise. And as we read through Proverbs, by the way, we will be diving into and digging deeper into Proverbs as we go through this series on the exilic literature, because Proverbs originates out of this time. But they were wise, and in Proverbs we see there are 12 ingredients to becoming wise. They were also already educated. They had already been taught, and now they were going to be taught foreign literature. They were going to become literate in the sense that they would become familiar with the stories of Babylon. They would become familiar with the culture of Babylon. They would become familiar with its history and how it thought. So they were educated, and they were to be taught, which means they were teachable. They were someone, these young men, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel, they were young men who were open to being taught. That makes them teachable. And number 6, they had a heart to learn foreign languages. Now, I've got a confession to make. I live in Tasmania. We are surrounded by water, not other nations. Wherever we go, everyone speaks our language. We have no motive to learn another language. But that may not be your story, and it may not be your future. So consider learning another language. Consider it and see what God will do with you. These are the 6 traits that Daniel exhibited when he was taken into Babylon. I'm reminded that in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 29, it says, "Do you see a man skillful in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before obscure men." And this is precisely what happened with Daniel and his 3 friends. Verse 5, "The king assigned them a daily portion of food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego." So we see that Daniel was already in a small community. He picked his friends well. He had good friends. I think this is a part of how anyone can be successful. Pick good friends. Pick the right kind of people who are going to make you a better you. Don't look to people who are going to drag you down. And this was certainly what Daniel did. He flourished in Babylon because he had good friends around him. This was a low, desperate, depressing time. But Daniel made the most of it. And for 3 years, he was trained and he was taught and he was educated. And the result was that he became the highest official in Babylon. But I'm running ahead in the story. In this section, I see that we're introduced to Daniel's resolve. A resolve is based on a conviction. You might have an idea, you might have an opinion, But a conviction is something you're prepared to pay a price for. We read this in verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, presumably because that food had been offered to idols, and he refused to eat that food as a result, or with wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And what we have here is the stage is set. Now we're introduced to Daniel. We're introduced to this extraordinary young man who becomes a great statesman, a prophet. And the book of Daniel is considered to be a part of what's called and referred to as the minor prophets, not because it's minor in importance, but because of its smallness in volume. In other words, there's only 12 chapters here in this section. In our Bibles, there's some apocryphal chapters that are added to it, but we'll discuss that a bit later. So Daniel was someone who lived by conviction. He resolved he wasn't going to go along with the crowd. He was prepared to stand up to the king of Babylon as a 15 or so year old young man. And as a result, he put his money where his mouth is, as we'll see as you read through this chapter. He makes a conditional promise to the chief eunuch that if, as a result of not